I never imagined that installing a simple privacy fence in my own backyard would turn my quiet Phoenix neighborhood into a battleground. But that's exactly what happened on the scorching Tuesday morning when Brenda Kessler knocked on my front door with a clipboard in one hand and a measuring tape in the other. "Mrs. Martinez, I'm afraid we have a problem," she announced, not bothering with pleasantries as the July sun beat down mercilessly on both of us. Her HOA president badge caught the light like a sheriff's star. "That fence you put up last weekend is in clear violation of our community standards." I squinted at her through the heat shimmer rising from my concrete driveway. "What fence violation? I checked the HOA guidelines 3 times before I even bought the materials. The height restriction is 6 feet maximum. Your fence measures 6 feet and 3 inches." She held up her measuring tape like evidence in a courtroom. "I measured it myself this morning at 7 a.m. "You were in my backyard at 7 in the morning." The words came out sharper than I intended, but the thought of this woman creeping around my property before sunrise made my skin crawl. "Without permission, I have every right as HOA president to inspect potential violations from any accessible vantage point." Brenda replied, her voice taking on that tone I'd grown to hate over the past 2 years since she'd been elected. "And your fence is clearly visible from the Hendersons' second-story window next door." I felt sweat beading on my forehead, and it wasn't just from the oppressive Arizona heat. "So you climbed up to their window to measure my fence." "Mrs. Henderson is very concerned about property values in our community. She called me personally." Brenda made a note on her clipboard with dramatic flourish. "This is your formal notice. You have 14 days to bring the fence into compliance or face a fine of $200 increasing by $50 each additional week." The absurdity of the situation hit me like the desert wind. 3 inches, 3 measly inches, on a fence that I'd installed to keep my elderly rescue dog, Copper, safe in the yard, and to give my family some privacy from our increasingly nosy neighbors. After my husband died 6 months ago, that backyard had become my sanctuary, the one place where I could sit with my morning coffee and grieve without judgment. "Brenda, this is ridiculous. 3 inches, really. Rules are rules, Elena. If we make exceptions for you, where does it end?" She turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and I'll be conducting a full property inspection next week to check for any other potential violations. Have a blessed day." I watched her march back down my driveway in her crisp white tennis outfit, clipboard clutched like a weapon, and knew this was far from over. That evening, I called my neighbor, Tom Henderson, hoping to get some clarity on this whole situation. Tom had always been reasonable, a retired engineer who kept to himself and maintained his property meticulously. "Elena, I'm so sorry about this mess," Tom said when he answered his phone. I could hear the genuine regret in his voice. "Margaret saw Brenda out there this morning with her measuring tape and asked what was going on. When Brenda told her about the fence height, Margaret just mentioned that she hoped it wouldn't affect our property values. She never asked Brenda to measure anything. So Brenda took it upon herself to climb up to your window." "That's the thing, Elena. She didn't climb anywhere. She was standing on our back patio with a telescope and measuring tape stretching it up toward your fence. Margaret saw her from the kitchen window and went out to ask what she was doing." I felt my stomach drop. "She was on your property without permission." "Well, technically, she asked Margaret if she could take a quick look at something, but she didn't specify what. Margaret thought she meant look at our garden." This was getting worse by the minute. "Tom, would you mind if I came over tomorrow evening to talk to Margaret? I just want to understand exactly what happened." "Of course. Come by around 6. We'll be having dinner on the back patio anyway, trying to catch any breeze we can get." The next day dragged by in the relentless Phoenix heat. I work from home as a freelance graphic designer, and I found myself staring out the window at my supposedly offensive fence instead of focusing on my client's logo redesign. The fence looked perfectly normal to me, a standard 6-foot privacy fence in a neutral cedar tone that complemented the desert landscaping my husband and I had spent 3 years perfecting. At 6 sharp, I walked over to the Hendersons' house, a pitcher of iced tea in hand, as a peace offering. The heat was still brutal, even as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. "Elena, dear, come sit in the shade." Margaret called from their covered patio. At 72, she moved with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to respect Arizona summers. Tom told me about your fence situation. What a mess. Margaret, I just want to make sure I understand what happened yesterday morning, I said, settling into one of their patio chairs and accepting a glass of their famous sweet tea. Can you walk me through it? Margaret glanced at Tom, who nodded encouragingly. Well, I was in the kitchen making coffee around 7 when I saw Brenda in our backyard. She had this long measuring tape thing, the kind that extends way out. Where exactly was she standing? Right there by our back fence, the one between our yards. She was stretching that tape up toward your new fence and writing things down on her clipboard. Tom leaned forward. When Margaret went out to ask what she was doing, Brenda said she was conducting an official HOA measurement and that she had the right to access any necessary vantage points for community enforcement. Did she ask permission to be in your backyard specifically? No, Margaret said firmly. She knocked on our front door earlier and asked if she could take a quick look at something in the back. I thought she meant our roses. Tom had just pruned them and they're looking beautiful this year. I felt a chill, despite the 98-degree temperature. So she essentially tricked you into letting her onto your property so she could measure my fence. That's exactly what happened, Tom said, his engineer's precision evident in his tone. And here's the thing, Elena, I've been thinking about this all day. I built fences for 20 years before I became an engineer. A 3-inch height variance could easily be due to ground slope or measurement error. Margaret nodded vigorously. Our whole neighborhood is on a slope. Nothing's perfectly level out here. Would you two be willing to be witnesses if this goes to a hearing? I asked, knowing I was probably going to need all the help I could get. Absolutely, Tom said. This is harassment, plain and simple. That night, I dug out my copy of the HOA covenants and conditions, a thick document I'd only skimmed when I moved in 8 years ago. What I found made my blood pressure spike even higher than the desert heat. The height restriction clause was buried on page 47 of a 60-page document, and it specifically stated that measurements should be taken from the natural grade at the base of the fence structure. I grabbed a flashlight and headed out to my backyard. Sure enough, my fence was installed on a slight slope. At the highest point of the natural grade, the fence measured exactly 6 feet. At the lowest point, where the ground dipped slightly, it measured 6 feet and 3 inches. But according to the HOA's own rules, the measurement should be from the natural grade, not some arbitrary point Brenda had chosen. The next morning, I drafted a formal response to Brenda's violation notice, citing the specific covenant language and requesting that the measurement be retaken according to the HOA's written guidelines. I sent it via certified mail to create a paper trail. 3 days later, Brenda was back at my door this time, accompanied by Jerry Walsh, the HOA vice president, and a local real estate agent who'd been trying to get me to sell my house ever since my husband passed away. Mrs. Martinez, we've reviewed your response to the violation notice, Jerry said, mopping his forehead with a handkerchief as we stood in the suffocating heat. While we appreciate your attention to detail, the board has determined that our original measurement stands. But you didn't measure from the natural grade as specified in the covenants. I replied, pulling out my printed copy of the relevant section. According to section 12.7-A, all fence measurements must be taken from the natural grade at the base of the structure. Brenda snatched the paper from my hand, scanned it quickly, and handed it back with a dismissive wave. The board has the discretion to interpret covenant language as we see fit for the good of the community. That's not how legal documents work, Brenda. Are you threatening legal action? Jerry asked, his salesman's smile faltering for the first time since I had known him. I'm asking you to follow your own rules. The fine stands, Brenda declared. You now have 11 days to comply, or the penalty increases to $250. After they left, I sat on my front step for a long moment watching the heat waves distort the pavement. This wasn't about 3 inches of fence anymore. This was about power control and probably Jerry's desire to see more properties turn over in the neighborhood so he could collect more commissions. That afternoon, I started making phone calls. First, I contacted David Chin, a neighbor 3 streets over, who'd mentioned at a community barbecue last year that he was an attorney specializing in property law. Elena, I remember you from the Johnson's barbecue, David said when I explained the situation. This sounds like a classic HOA overreach case. Can you email me the violation notice and your response? What are my options here? Well, first thing is to document everything, every interaction, every phone call, every piece of mail. Second, you mentioned they were on your neighbor's property without proper permission to conduct the measurement. That could be trespass depending on how it played out. They tricked the neighbors into letting them into the backyard. That's potentially fraudulent entry, even trickier for the HOA. I could hear David typing in the background. Look, I can't give you legal advice over the phone, but I can tell you that HOAs have to follow their own governing documents. If they're not measuring according to their stated procedures, that's a problem for them. What would you suggest I do next? Request the hearing that you're entitled to under your CCNRs. Make them prove their case in front of the other homeowners. And Elena start attending HOA board meetings. You might be surprised what you learn. That evening, I sent a certified letter requesting a formal hearing regarding the violation. I also sent a separate letter demanding that the HOA provide documentation of Brenda's authority to enter private property for the purpose of conducting measurements. The response came faster than I expected. Jerry Walsh called me directly the next morning. Elena, I think we can work something out here, he said, his voice carrying that smooth real estate agent tone. What if we reduce the fine to $50 as a good faith gesture that would save you the hassle of a hearing? I don't owe a fine, Jerry. The fence complies with the covenants as written. Come on, Elena, $50. You spend more than that on groceries. The condescension in his voice made my teeth clench. I'm not paying anything. I want my hearing. Fine. But you should know that hearings can take months to schedule, and the fines keep accumulating while we wait. Then I guess you'd better schedule it quickly. 2 weeks later, I received notice that my hearing was scheduled for the following month's board meeting. In the meantime, I'd been busy. I attended the July board meeting as David had suggested, and what I witnessed there opened my eyes to just how dysfunctional our HOA had become under Brenda's leadership. The meeting was held in the community center, a stuffy room with inadequate air conditioning that made the 30 attendees look like wilted flowers. Brenda sat at the head table with Jerry and the 3 other board members conducting the meeting like a corporate boardroom instead of a community gathering. Item 7, violation notices. Brenda announced reading from her agenda. We issued 14 notices this month for various infractions, including fence height, unauthorized landscaping modifications, and improper trash can placement. An elderly man in the front row raised his hand. Brenda, I got one of those landscaping notices, but I just planted native desert plants that are supposed to be encouraged according to the water conservation guidelines we received last year. Native plants still need to be approved by the architectural committee, Brenda replied without looking up from her notes. But the architectural committee hasn't met in 6 months, the man protested. Then you should have waited for them to schedule a meeting. I watched this exchange with growing dismay. The architectural committee chair had moved to Oregon in February, and no replacement had been appointed. Essentially, Brenda was making it impossible for homeowners to get landscaping approval while simultaneously fining them for making any changes. The meeting continued with similar examples of bureaucratic overreach. A young couple was fined for having their garbage cans visible from the street on a non-collection day, even though their garage door was broken and they were waiting for repair parts. A retired teacher was cited for having a small American flag in her front flower bed, apparently violating a no unauthorized displays rule that no one could find in the actual covenants. During the public comment period, I stood up. I'm Elena Martinez from Saguaro Drive. I'd like to understand the process for board recall elections. The room went dead silent. Brenda's face flushed red, visible even in the dim lighting. That's not appropriate discussion for a board meeting, she snapped. Actually, it is, said a voice from the back. I turned to see a woman about my age with grayin hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Board recall procedures are covered in Section 15 of our CCNRs, and any homeowner has the right to inquire about them during public comment. And you are, Brenda asked icily. Susan Rodriguez, Desert Willow Circle. I'm also the former HOA secretary before I resigned last year due to concerns about board governance. This was getting interesting. Susan continued, the recall process requires a petition signed by 25% of homeowners, followed by a community-wide vote. If anyone wants specific details, I'd be happy to discuss them after the meeting. This meeting is adjourned, Brenda announced even though we were only halfway through the agenda. As people filed out, Susan approached me. I heard about your fence situation through the neighborhood grapevine. Want to grab coffee sometime this week and talk? Absolutely. We met 3 days later at a cafe in central Phoenix, away from the neighborhood where Brenda and her allies might overhear. Susan turned out to be a wealth of information about the HOA's recent history and Brenda's increasingly authoritarian management style. It started about a year after she was elected. Susan explained, stirring her iced latte. Little things at first, insisting that all board communications go through her, scheduling meetings without proper notice, making unilateral decisions and presenting them as board votes. What made you resign as secretary? Susan's expression darkened. She wanted me to backdate meeting minutes to make it look like the board had approved a special assessment that was never actually voted on. When I refused, she made my life miserable, constant criticism questioning every minute detail of my work scheduling meetings. At times, she knew I couldn't attend. How many board members are up for election this year? 3 out of 5. Brenda's term runs through next year, but Jerry and 2 others are up for re-election in November. I felt a spark of hope. Do you think there are enough concerned homeowners to make a difference? Elena, I've been keeping a list of everyone who's been unfairly targeted by Brenda's violation spree. It's over 40 households in the past 18 months. Susan pulled out her phone and scrolled through her notes. The couple with the broken garage door, the man with the native plants, the teacher with the flag, plus dozens of others. Fines for having patio furniture that's supposedly the wrong color for parking in their own driveways during certain hours for having children's bikes visible in front yards. 40 households out of how many total? We have about 230 homes in the community, so we're talking about nearly 20% of homeowners who've been directly impacted. The wheels in my head were turning. Susan, would you be willing to help me with something? I'd like to survey the neighborhood before my hearing, find out how many people are aware of what's been happening, and whether they'd support changes to the board. I thought you'd never ask. Over the next 2 weeks, Susan and I conducted an informal door-to-door survey of our neighborhood. What we discovered was both encouraging and infuriating. Most homeowners had no idea about the extent of Brenda's violation enforcement because they'd been lucky enough to avoid her scrutiny. But once we explained what was happening, the response was overwhelmingly negative. She fined the Patels for having their children's bicycles in the front yard, asked Maria Santos, a working mother of 2 young kids. What are they supposed to do, carry them through the house every time the kids want to ride? The Hendersons told me about your fence situation, said Bob Miller, a retiree who lived at the end of my street. 3 inches, that's insane. By the time we finished our informal survey, we had documented 47 households that had received questionable violation notices and another 68 that expressed serious concerns about the current board's management style. More importantly, we had 32 homeowners who expressed willingness to run for board positions or actively campaign for new leadership. My hearing was scheduled for the August board meeting, and I spent the days leading up to it preparing meticulously. Tom Henderson had measured my fence at multiple points and documented that it complied with the natural grade measurement requirement. Margaret had written a statement describing Brenda's deceptive entry onto their property. David Chen had provided me with a summary of relevant property law, though he emphasized he wasn't representing me as an attorney. The night before the hearing, my doorbell rang at 8 p.m. I opened the door to find Jerry Walsh standing there alone, his usual salesman smile replaced by something more calculating. Elena, I wanted to have a private conversation with you before tomorrow night. About what? I think we both know this fence thing has gotten out of hand. What if I told you the board was prepared to drop the violation entirely? No fine, no forced compliance, clean slate. I studied his face in the porch light. What's the catch, Jerry? No catch, just community harmony. We all want the same thing here, a peaceful neighborhood where everyone gets along. And in exchange, Jerry shifted uncomfortably. Well, I'd hate to see you get involved in any neighborhood political drama. Board elections can get pretty ugly, lots of personal attacks and hurt feelings. There it was. You want me to drop my support for board changes? I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Jerry's mask slipped slightly. Elena, you're new to HOA politics. You don't understand how these things work. Board members volunteer their time for the good of the community. When homeowners start making accusations and demands, it creates an adversarial environment that hurts property values. Property values. That's what this is really about, isn't it? Property values affect everyone in the neighborhood. No, Jerry. Property values affect real estate agents who want more turnover and more commissions. They affect people like you who make money every time someone sells their house. His expression hardened. That's a serious accusation. It's an observation. How many of the homeowners who've been fined for violations have you contacted about selling their properties? Jerry didn't answer, which was answer enough. I'll see you at the hearing tomorrow, I said, closing the door. The August board meeting was packed. Word had spread through the neighborhood about my hearing, and the community center was filled beyond capacity. I recognized many of the faces from Susan's and my informal survey, but there were also people I'd never seen before. Brenda called the meeting to order with visible tension in her voice. Before we begin tonight's agenda, I want to remind everyone that board meetings are conducted according to parliamentary procedure. Disruptions will not be tolerated. The first part of the meeting dragged through routine business reports, but I could feel the anticipation building in the room. Finally, Brenda announced Item 12 violation hearing for Elena Martinez Saguaro Drive. I stood and walked to the front of the room, my folder of documentation in hand. Thank you for this hearing. I'm here to contest the fence violation issued on July 15th. State your case, Brenda said curtly. The violation notice claims my fence exceeds the 6-foot height limit by 3 inches. However, according to Section 12.7-A of our covenants, fence measurements must be taken from the natural grade at the base of the structure. I held up Tom Henderson's measurements. When measured correctly from the natural grade, my fence complies with the height restriction at all points. Jerry leaned forward. The board has already determined that our measurement was accurate. Your measurement was taken from an arbitrary point, not the natural grade as required by the covenants. Who says it was arbitrary? Brenda demanded. Tom Henderson stood up from his seat in the audience. I do. I'm an engineer, and I watched you take that measurement from my back patio. You measured from the lowest point of ground slope, not the natural grade where the fence posts were installed. Margaret Henderson also stood. And you gained access to our property under false pretenses. You told me you wanted to take a quick look at something in our backyard, but you didn't specify that you intended to measure Elena's fence. A murmur ran through the crowd. Brenda's face was getting redder by the minute. Now that's irrelevant, she snapped. The measurement stands. Actually, it's very relevant, said a new voice from the back of the room. David Chen had arrived. I'm an attorney and I've reviewed this case. Taking measurements from private property without informed consent could constitute trespass. More importantly, HOAs are legally required to follow their own governing documents. If the covenants specify natural grade measurement, that's the standard that must be used. The room erupted in whispered conversations. Brenda pounded her gavel. Mr. Chen, you're not a party to this hearing. I'm a homeowner in this community, and I have the right to speak during hearings that affect community governance. One of the other board members, a quiet woman named Patricia Mills, who rarely spoke during meetings, cleared her throat. I'd like to see the measurement documentation from both parties. For the next 20 minutes, Patricia and the other board members reviewed Tom's measurements photos of my fence and the relevant covenant language. The room remained tense but quiet during their deliberation. Finally, Patricia spoke. Based on the evidence presented, it appears that the fence does comply with covenant requirements when measured from the natural grade, as specified in our governing documents. I disagree, Brenda said immediately. I call for a board vote, Patricia replied. All in favor of dismissing the violation. 3 hands went up. Patricia board member Kenneth Liu, and surprisingly, board treasurer Amanda Foster, who had been one of Brenda's allies. Jerry and Brenda voted to uphold the violation, but they were outnumbered. The violation is dismissed, Patricia announced. The audience broke into applause, which Brenda tried to gavel down unsuccessfully. But I wasn't done yet. I have one more matter for the board's consideration. The hearing is over, Brenda snapped. This concerns HOA governance procedures, I replied. According to Section 4.2 of our covenants, any homeowner may present concerns about board conduct during the public comment portion of meetings. Patricia nodded. Please proceed, Mrs. Martinez. I'm formally requesting that the board adopt a policy requiring written permission from property owners before HOA representatives enter private property for any inspection or measurement purpose. I'm also requesting that all future violation measurements be conducted by licensed surveyors to ensure accuracy and eliminate disputes like tonight's. The crowd murmured approval. Several people called out, "Second," and "Great idea." Brenda's composure finally cracked completely. This is ridiculous. We can't be expected to hire surveyors for every minor violation. Then maybe you should focus on actual violations instead of manufacturing them, called out Susan Rodriguez from the audience. That's enough, Brenda shouted, abandoning any pretense of parliamentary procedure. This meeting is over. She stormed out of the room, leaving the other board members and the crowd in stunned silence. Jerry quickly gathered his papers and followed her, but Patricia, Kenneth, and Amanda remained at the front table. Patricia stood up. I apologize for that outburst. The meeting will continue with the remaining agenda items. Over the next hour, the 3 remaining board members conducted the most productive HOA meeting I'd witnessed since moving to the neighborhood. They discussed several resident concerns with patience and actual problem solving, approved 3 pending architectural requests that had been languishing for months, and agreed to form a committee to review HOA governance procedures. As the meeting wound down, Patricia made an announcement that surprised everyone. I want the community to know that I'll be submitting my resignation from the board effective September 1st. The room buzzed with concerned voices. Patricia raised her hand for quiet. My resignation isn't about tonight's events. My husband has been offered a job opportunity in Colorado and will be relocating. However, I want to be clear that I believe this community deserves board leadership that serves homeowners' interests rather than personal agendas. After the meeting, dozens of people came up to thank me for challenging the violation and to express their concerns about HOA governance. Many asked about the board recall process Susan had mentioned at the July meeting. The election is in November. Susan reminded a group gathered around us in the parking lot. We don't need a recall if we can elect new board members. How many positions are up for election? Asked Maria Santos. 3 out of 5. If we elect 3 new members, we'd have a completely different board dynamic. Bob Miller raised his hand. I'll run. I'm retired. I've got time to do the job right, and I'm tired of seeing neighbors harassed over nonsense. I'll run too, said David Chen. This community needs board members who understand legal compliance and proper governance. Over the next few weeks, a grassroots campaign organization emerged from the concerned homeowners who'd attended the August meeting. Susan Rodriguez agreed to serve as campaign coordinator, and we established 3 main goals. Elect new board members committed to fair enforcement, revise HOA policies to prevent future overreach, and restore community cooperation instead of adversarial relationships between the board and homeowners. We had 3 candidates, Bob Miller, David Chen, and Maria Santos, who had initially been reluctant but agreed to run after several neighbors convinced her that the community needed working parents' perspectives on the board. The campaign was unlike anything our quiet suburban neighborhood had ever experienced. We organized coffee meetings in people's homes, printed flyers on campaign issues, and conducted a comprehensive survey of homeowner priorities. What we discovered was that most residents wanted basic services, well-maintained common areas, fair enforcement of reasonable rules, and competent financial management rather than the aggressive micromanagement that had characterized Brenda's leadership. Our opponents weren't idle either. Brenda recruited 2 candidates to run alongside Jerry for re-election, a local businessman who owned rental properties in the community, and a woman whose primary qualification seemed to be her friendship with Brenda. The campaign turned nasty in early October when Brenda began sending letters to homeowners claiming that our candidates were anti HOA extremists who wanted to eliminate all community standards. She organized a concerned homeowners meeting at her house and invited speakers from a property management company to discuss the dangers of inexperienced board leadership. Jerry Walsh stepped up his real estate activities, sending marketing postcards to every household with messages about protecting property values through strong community governance. The not so subtle implication was that changes to board leadership would hurt home values. But their tactics backfired. The more aggressive Brenda became, the more homeowners began to question whether her leadership style was good for the community. The tipping point came in mid-October when she issued violation notices to 6 families for having Halloween decorations up more than 2 weeks before the holiday. She cited us for having a scarecrow in our front yard, complained Jennifer Walsh, a young mother who lived 2 streets over from me. It's mid-October. When are we supposed to put up Halloween decorations? The Halloween violation notices became a rallying cry for our campaign. Susan organized a Halloween decoration solidarity event where dozens of families put up decorations early and dared the board to fine all of them. When no additional citations were issued, it became clear that Brenda had overreached even by her own standards. The election was held on November 15th, with voting conducted at the community center from noon to 8 p.m. Turnout was unprecedented in our neighborhood's history. Over 60% of eligible households cast ballots compared to the usual 15 to 20%. Susan and I volunteered as poll monitors, and by mid-afternoon, it was clear that our campaign had generated genuine enthusiasm among homeowners who'd never participated in HOA politics before. I saw elderly residents who'd lived in the neighborhood for decades walk into the community center with their ballots, young families pushing strollers to vote during their lunch breaks, and working parents stopping by after work despite the long day. The ballot counting was conducted publicly at 8:30 p.m., with representatives from both campaigns observing the process. As each batch of ballots was tallied, our leads grew larger. Bob Miller won his race with over 70% of the vote. Maria Santos captured 62% despite her opponent's attempts to portray her as too inexperienced for board service. David Chen won the closest race with 54%, but it was still a decisive victory. Jerry Walsh lost his re-election bid by 18 percentage points. The victory celebration at Bob Miller's house that night was unlike anything I'd experienced since my husband's funeral, but in the best possible way. Neighbors who'd barely spoken to each other before the campaign were sharing stories, making plans, and talking about community projects they'd been afraid to suggest under the previous board's leadership. You know what this means?" Susan asked me as we sat on Bob's back patio, looking out over the desert mountains silhouetted against the star-filled sky. "Tomorrow morning you can wake up and not worry about someone with a measuring tape sneaking around your property." She was right, but it was about more than that. For the first time since my husband died, I felt like I was part of a real community again, not just a collection of houses with rules enforced by petty bureaucrats, but a neighborhood where people looked out for each other and worked together to solve problems. The new board's first meeting in December was a study in contrast to the meetings I'd attended under Brenda's leadership. Bob Miller was elected board president, and his first order of business was establishing a new governance policy requiring board members to recuse themselves from any decisions involving their personal financial interests. David Chen was appointed to lead a review of all pending violation cases, with a mandate to dismiss any citations that didn't involve genuine community safety or property maintenance issues. Maria Santos proposed creating an architectural review committee with rotating membership and clear timelines for approval decisions addressing one of the biggest complaints homeowners had raised during the campaign. Patricia Mills's replacement, a retired teacher named Robert Kim, who'd run unopposed for the vacant seat, suggested implementing a community newsletter to improve communication between the board and homeowners. Even Amanda Foster, the lone holdover from the previous board, seemed energized by the new collaborative approach. She presented a financial report showing that the community's reserve fund was actually in better condition than Brenda had claimed, meaning several proposed special assessments could be deferred or eliminated entirely. By January, the changes were visible throughout the neighborhood. The harassment style violation enforcement had ended, replaced by a system focused on genuine health and safety issues. The architectural committee was approving reasonable requests promptly instead of letting them languish for months. Most importantly, the adversarial relationship between the board and homeowners had been replaced by genuine collaboration. I received a formal letter in February officially closing my fence violation case and confirming that no fines or penalties would be assessed. But the real vindication came a few weeks later when Tom Henderson mentioned that he'd seen Brenda Kessler's house was listed for sale. "She's moving to Scottsdale," Tom told me as we chatted over our shared fence, the fence that had started this whole journey. "Apparently, the neighborhood doesn't meet her standards anymore." Margaret Henderson joined us in the backyard carrying glasses of her famous sweet tea. "Good riddance," she said with uncharacteristic bluntness. "That woman turned our community into a police state." "What about Jerry Walsh?" I asked. "Oh, he's still around, still selling real estate," Tom replied. "But he's not targeting our neighbors anymore. I think he learned his lesson about trying to manipulate HOA politics for personal profit." As spring arrived and the desert began its spectacular bloom season, our neighborhood felt genuinely renewed. Children's bicycles appeared in front yards without fear of citations. Residents planted gardens and hung patio lights and installed wind chimes without looking over their shoulders for clipboard-wielding enforcers. The final closure came in April when David Chen approached me with a folder of documents. "Elena, I thought you'd want to see this," he said, settling into one of my patio chairs as Copper dozed in the shade nearby. "We found some interesting things while reviewing the previous board's records, such as Brenda issued over 200 violation notices during her 2-year tenure as president. That's more than the previous 5 years combined." David opened his folder. "But here's the really interesting part. She only issued violations to households that hadn't used Jerry Walsh as their real estate agent." I stared at him. "You mean the violation enforcement was systematically targeting people?" "It looks that way. Jerry provided Brenda with lists of homeowners he'd approached about selling, and those households were never cited for violations even when they had obvious issues. Meanwhile, homeowners who'd used other agents or who'd refused his services received citations for minor infractions." "Well, that's conspiracy." "It's also potentially actionable under state real estate regulations and HOA governance law. But since both of them are effectively out of power now, the new board decided to focus on moving forward rather than looking backward. It was probably the right decision, but knowing the truth about what had motivated the harassment campaign gave me a sense of complete closure. My fence violation hadn't been about community standards or property values. It had been about power and money, plain and simple. 6 months after that intimidating July morning, when Brenda first appeared at my door with her measuring tape, I was sitting in the same backyard, enjoying the peaceful evening air and watching Copper explore his secure domain behind the fence that had caused so much trouble. The 3-inch height variance that had supposedly threatened our entire community's property values was barely noticeable unless you knew exactly where to look for it. Susan Rodriguez joined me for coffee that evening, as had become our weekly tradition since the election. "Any regrets about getting involved in all this drama?" she asked, settling into the chair that had become hers. I considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, I'd been a grieving widow who wanted nothing more than to tend my garden and remember my husband in peace. Getting dragged into HOA politics had been the last thing I'd wanted to deal with. But looking around at my neighborhood now, children playing freely in front yards, neighbors chatting over shared fences, gardens, blooming without fear of citations, I realized that fighting for this community had been exactly what I'd needed to heal from my loss. "No regrets," I told Susan. "Sometimes you have to stand up for what's right even when it's easier to just pay the fine and move on." "Especially when it's easier to just pay the fine and move on," Susan corrected. "That's when they're counting on you to give up." As the desert sunset painted the mountains in shades of pink and gold, I reflected on the lessons I'd learned from my fence dispute. HOA covenants and community rules are meant to protect everyone's interests, not to serve as weapons for petty power struggles. Neighbors looking out for neighbors will always be more effective than bureaucrats with clipboards. And sometimes 3 inches can represent the difference between a community and a dictatorship. Most importantly, I'd learned that ordinary people have more power than they realize when they're willing to work together for common goals. The measuring tape that had threatened to destroy my peace of mind had ultimately helped build something much stronger, a real community where people care about each other instead of just property values. My fence still stands exactly where I built it 3 inches taller than Brenda Kessler thought it should be, and exactly as tall as it needs to be to keep my dog safe and my family's privacy protected. This is a dramatized story inspired by common HOA disputes, not legal advice.